Hello everyone, it's Miss Smith again, and this is lesson 3 on preparing to write about Macbeth. Okay, so again, you should have a PowerPoint that your teacher sent to you and some sheets that you can print off and write on if you want to. But again, as ever, if you're writing in your exercise book and keeping all of your notes there, that's absolutely fine as well. Okay, so the first activity today is on slide 2 of your PowerPoint, and you should have a blank sheet as well to work on. That your teachers sent you of a graph outline, so you can use that too. Okay, so our first activity today is to start to think about Act One as a whole and how Shakespeare is kind of building tension and playing around with our reactions. Because if you remember, we're writing about how does Shakespeare use Act One to interest the audience and get them engaged in what's happening. Okay, so your task is to create a tension graph, and it's up to you to pick your events. I've picked some for mine, but you can pick different ones. You need to pick between 6 and 10 key events along the bottom, write them on, and then for each event you're going to plot how tense the audience is feeling at that particular moment. So if you'll see down the side of the graph here, we've gone from being really relaxed and calm and a state of quite low tension right the way up to really tense, very tense, intolerable there. You can't bear it. Okay, so I've picked the appearance of the witches, Duncan's meeting with the captain, the entrance of Macbeth when he comes on stage and says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," Macbeth hearing the predictions of the witches, that bit. Then Lady Macbeth's big speeches when she receives Macbeth's letter and has that soliloquy where she's kind of conjuring help from spirits and those things. The bit where she's talking about how Macbeth's too full of the milk of human kindness and she realises she's going to have to persuade him and influence him. And then I've gone, my 6th event is at the very end of the act when Macbeth seems to make a decision and resolve to go ahead with the murder and the plan that Lady Macbeth has come up with, or helped him to come up with. Okay, so I've just picked 6 events here, but really I'm doing that because of the size of my screen. You can have more than that if you want to. Okay, so you're looking for between 6 and 10 key events. You might want some of mine, you might want all of mine, or you might want to pick entirely different moments. Okay, so you're going to make a line graph. So for each one you're going to put a little star, or I've put a number where you think the tension is for the audience. Okay, I'm just putting them anywhere just to give you an example at the moment. Okay, so can you go off and decide on your moments, and can you plot them against how tense the audience are feeling at each stage, please? So if you pause the video and go and do that now, and then when you come back I'll show you what I've come up with. Okay, speak to you again in a minute. Okay, so for my first event, the first appearance of the witches at the beginning of the play, that's quite a tense moment, isn't it? It's quite scary to start with witches, particularly if you are a member of the original audience and you would be believing that witches are, that they perhaps do exist in society, that they are a symbol of wickedness and evil. So you're expecting the levels of tension amongst the audience to be pretty high there. For some people, that's, you know, if they're really terrified and really absolutely believing witches, are going to be right up there, but certainly kind of thinking in this area. My second event is the captain talking to Duncan about Macbeth and about the end of the battle. So I'm not thinking that we're going to be as tense there. I'm expecting a kind of relief from the tension of the very first scene there, because it's a positive scene, it's really celebratory, people are happy, we're hearing great things about Macbeth and his successors, and we've come to see a play called Macbeth, so we know it's all about him, so we're pleased to hear him spoken of so positively. So I'm going to say that we're down here, kind of quite low tension. Entrance of Macbeth, though, I think Shakespeare builds the tension back up a little bit with his first words, because we've been fearful and tense at stage 1 already, and then at the end of stage 1 we hear the witches talking about Macbeth, and then lo and behold, here he comes. His first words that he says as he comes on stage, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." So Shakespeare certainly builds tension because the audience is thinking, hang on a minute, why is he saying exactly the same words as those characters that we take as being representations of evil and wickedness? So, you know, somewhere around here. So we've had a little dip and oh, Macbeth seems like a hero here, to hang on a minute, he's maybe not as clear as it first seemed. Perhaps he's not quite so heroic. Okay, and then we have the predictions that the witches make when they appear to Macbeth and Banquo. And again, I would say Shakespeare's starting to gradually build up the tension again there, because we have just heard, because of our extra information from over here in Duncan talk about the Thane of Cawdor, we've heard that one of those predictions has come true already. So we're starting to think, well, the witches are evil, they're making these predictions, the predictions are coming true, the next prediction is going to be to kill a king. We know that a king is seen as God's representative on earth, and you should not kill a king. It's quite clear that that's going to unleash all sorts of disorder and chaos into the world. So certainly a modern audience will pick up on the unease, but a Jacobean audience would be very uneasy about that, particularly in the context of James I recently ascending the throne after the confusion of the end of Elizabeth I's reign. So certainly a kind of higher degree of tension there. And then we meet Lady Macbeth. And she doesn't really do anything to alleviate the tension, does she? She kind of starts to build it up a little bit as well, because she is suggesting that murder is on the cards and that it's something that she's prepared to engage in. She talks to spirits. She talks about repressing the more feminine side of herself. She presents herself as a clearly transgressive woman, or rather Shakespeare presents herself presents her as being transgressive, someone who's crossing a line and pushing boundaries, and we feel very uneasy about that. So it's a real development in tension there as well. Obviously it's a kind of good tension, because we want to see what's going to happen and are they going to go through with it. But you can see my graph starts very tense, a little dip, and then it steadily, Shakespeare's keeping building on tension all the way through to my last moment, which is at the end of Act One, where Macbeth has been going to do it and then really struggled with his decision and tells Lady Macbeth, we will proceed no further in this business, and then eventually comes to the conclusion that he is going to do it. Okay, so I'm going to put that just a little bit high, and I'm not putting it intolerable yet, because I think there's things that happen later on that kind of would push me right up to the top there, but certainly there's tension there, and Macbeth resolves to go through with it and to hide his true feelings. So if I was doing this on paper, I'd be drawing a line here so that I can see this steady build of tension all of the way through, and a real sort of sense of unease and fear and anxiety for the audience. Okay, so you should have something similar on your sheet, although it will look different to mine depending on the kinds of events that you've picked. But if you want to go back and make any changes or add anything because of what I've just said, then that's fine. Okay, and then when you're ready, if you go to slide 4 on your PowerPoint, we're going to carry on in the same way that we did last lesson to look at those different elements of stop sec to help you build some notes about some of the choices that Shakespeare's making in Act 1 to engage the audience. So this lesson, on slide 4, you're going to have a look at point of view, character, shifts and endings. So if you go back to that, and then the first set of prompts are all on point of view, and they'll give you lots of questions to help you think about how point of view might be relevant and might be helpful in allowing us to talk about how Shakespeare engages the audience. So when you've done your notes on those 4 elements, if you come back, I'll talk you through some of my ideas. Okay, thank you. Okay, so you should have had a think about point of view, shifts, characters and endings by now, and you've probably got lots of notes on this sheet or in your exercise book. Same as I said yesterday, really there's no expectation that you've got exactly the same things as me. You know, I know what you like a lot alike in lessons. You come up with brilliant ideas all of the time and things that me and your other teachers have not heard before, so you definitely will have some things that I've not got, and just be confident that as long as you can prove for them, your ideas are right as well. But all I'm doing here is making sure that everybody's got some things that they can talk about so that you all feel happy and confident. Okay, so we'll start with point of view first of all. Okay, so there's lots of ways that we find out different points of view of Macbeth's character in the opening act of the play, we can talk about the varied voices that we hear. We do hear several different characters talking about him, and that's an interesting structural choice made by Shakespeare, isn't it? Because we hear about Macbeth before we see him, but they're not the most reliable people, are they? Perhaps the captain is one of the most reliable people because he's been sort of on the battlefield with Macbeth and with people who've witnessed Macbeth, and so we hear from him about the bravery of Macbeth, noble, valiant, and all of those kinds of things. And we know that Macbeth is held in high opinion, and all of these different points of view of him present him as being this heroic figure that we expect of our tragic hero. But we do need to be aware that they're not reliable. We hear from the king, noble cousin, he calls him, but the king's not really reliable. He's not a great judge of character. He gets it wrong with the first Thane of Cawdor, albeit most people probably got it wrong with him. But then he says that line that me and my class talked about quite a lot because I quite like it. He says, "There's no art to find the mind's construction in the face," which is essentially you can't tell what someone's like by how they look. You can't judge a book by its cover. So he sort of says things like that, but he still gets it wrong. So he's not a great judge of character. So his words, we've got to kind of worry about those as well. Lady Macbeth obviously knows Macbeth really well, and she talks about how he's too full of the milk of human kindness. And that's interesting as well. She's his wife, so she might kind of have a bias towards him. She also might get it wrong. We know she's kind of an interesting character, and she does very dubious things, doesn't she? But she says this in the middle of making a speech where she's imploring spirits to help her. So how much can we trust her? But all of these things, like she talks about him being full of the milk of human kindness, the other characters talk about him being this brave warrior. So we see this kind of pull in Macbeth's character of being a warrior, of being someone who goes on the battlefield and fights, who can unseam someone from the knave to the chops, but is also kind. And we do see later on that he does have this sort of sense of morality and of right and wrong, and he's torn and pulled between these two elements of himself. And then of course we hear the witches talking about him, so that kind of colours what we think about them as well, because of our expectations of witches as being evil. But I'm kind of struck by this quotation. I think I'll keep coming back to it in relation to lots of these different areas that we're looking at today. And Macbeth himself says, "This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good." But it just sort of sums up this kind of, well, this sense of ambiguity and this pull between good and evil, but there is certainly a pull between good and evil in Macbeth. So I might just keep playing around with that quote and coming back to it. I've got some other quotes that connect in with that as well. Okay, all of these things reveal a lot about Macbeth's character, so we'll just dip down into character here. So he's ambitious, but he echoes the witches in his ambition and in what he says, which is a bit frightening. And it's the witches who kind of first introduce us to him, so they shape how we view his character. The other characters that we're being presented to, obviously the first characters we meet are the witches, who are very sinister and evil. And the thing to think about with them is because they appear first, there is a suggestion that they are in control. And because they appear first, having this meeting, we're having a meeting about when they're going to have another meeting, and we think they've probably been conjuring or doing spells in this first meeting that we've just joined them at the end of. And if you remember the Roman Polanski version of the film that you watched in lessons at school, we see them kind of putting dismembered body parts and all sorts of things into the sand, and it's like they're engaged in a spell when we first meet them, and that kind of contributes to this idea of them being controlling. So they set this controlling, dominant tone for the beginning of the play, a play called Macbeth, where we might expect to meet Macbeth, but we meet these witches. So that's a really important element of character that I want you to think about here, and how much power these witches have, because when they next meet Macbeth and Banquo, they again seem to be powerful, don't they? They tell them things that they say will happen, and when Macbeth and Banquo try to question them further, they disappear. So it seems like they are in charge. And we're talking about Duncan before, when we're talking about these opinions, and that the characterization of Duncan as being good but not a great judge of character, it doesn't really seem like Duncan is in charge, even though we see Duncan giving out rewards and giving out punishments and deciding where he's going and who he's going to stay with. We still have this sense that, but are the witches in control of everything, and how far can they take this control? An interesting thing to think about, just to kind of keep in mind, and not that it would particularly help you write about Act 1 for your essay this week, but it's just a thought to have in the back of your mind, is they just disappear by the end of the play, don't they? So if they are in control, why does Shakespeare not have them come back at the end and kind of round things off? So it's an interesting thing for you to think about there. Okay, moving. Oh, actually, before I move on to shifts, I'm just going to talk a little bit when we're thinking about point of view and we're thinking about character. There are quite a few in Act 1, quite a few soliloquies that you could look at that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have. I'm not going to go into them in lots of detail, but just a couple of pointers for you and things that you could think about. So obviously, I've used this quote already, cannot be ill, cannot be good, and down here hidden away I've got this false face must hide what false heart must know. So we've got these kind of ambiguous statements all of the time about morality and about this pull between good and evil, and on the surface, in the dialogue that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth use with other characters, they're presenting themselves as good, moral people, aren't they? But the soliloquies reveal the other side of them. And it's interesting to note, if you track what they're saying across the soliloquies, how in tune with each other Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are, even before they've set foot on stage together. So Shakespeare shows that they're thinking about the same things. So, for example, once the witches have made their predictions to Macbeth, and Macbeth's thinking about it, and he's delivering a soliloquy. He talks about his black desires, and then, as you'll know very well from the RSC's lesson last week, Lady Macbeth talks about the blanket of the dark. She doesn't want heaven to peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold. So we've got Macbeth talking about black desires, Lady Macbeth talking about darkness there. So their soliloquies show that they're connected, as these two characters are very in sync with each other at this point in the play. The other thing that his soliloquies show is that he does seem to understand the complexities of the situation that he's in and the complexities of the world in which he's placed, really. And much of what he says in his soliloquies you can trace back to the line of the witches, fair is foul and foul is fair, and Macbeth's first line, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. So, for example, after he first meets the witches, he says, nothing is but what is not. And then we've got, again, this other one that I keep coming back to, cannot be ill, cannot be good. He fully understands the complexities of life and the complexities that this situation is that he's found himself in. And it kind of backs up what we were talking about before, this presentation of him being heroic and valiant, but also being full of the milk of human kindness, a warrior, but moral and conflicted. Okay, so there's some really interesting things that you can think about. Obviously, I think everything about Macbeth's interesting, but I keep saying things are interesting, I apologise for that. But there are very interesting things you can think about in relation to point of view and character there already. Okay, so let's have a look at shifts. We talked a little bit about this last lesson when we were looking at settings and the movement between them, but we'll just think about it a little bit more. So if we kind of map out the settings again, so we can trace the shifts, the movements between them. So it kind of goes the heath to the battlefield and the royal camp, wherever Duncan is, where he's having that conversation with the captain, back to the heath again, this outdoor space where Macbeth meets the witches with Banquo, back to Duncan's royal camp where he proclaims Malcolm as his heir, and then on to Macbeth's castle. So again, as we spoke about last lesson, there's this movement. This is an opening act full of movement. Characters are on the move all the time, getting from one place to another, and it's a little bit, it picks up the pace and it suggests it's going to be kind of exciting and edgy, but it's a bit disorientating, and we get a sense of moving between worlds, moving between worlds of different status. So we've got kind of the sort of everybody of all different statuses in the battlefield, to royalty, to these marginalised figures on the heath and in the witches, and this kind of otherworldly characters there. And all of this is kind of builds a tension, as we've talked about already. And again, I've got this quotation, false face must hide what false heart doth know, and cannot be ill, cannot be good. I think these connect with these settings, that we're kind of neither in one place or another, and we're moving between places, settings, ideas, characters, and because we've been told by the witches that fair is foul and foul is fair, it's difficult to kind of place good and evil and truth and things like that in this opening scene. Okay, so a couple of things for you to think about there. One of the other tasks that you were asked to do on your sheet was to have a look at the opening and closing lines of each scene, and I think I'm not going to talk about that here really because of space and time, but if you do that, it's a really useful thing to do, just to kind of make you think, right, oh right, well that scene ended with this character speaking, but now we've got a leap to a completely different character or a completely different setting in the next scene, and just have a think about that, how that adds to interest, or how it builds tension, or kind of provides a bit of a release from the tension. Okay, so let's move on to look at endings. I've got the word trajectory there because we're kind of thinking about where something's going, where the characters are going, where the plot's going, and the whole act where it's moving to is Macbeth's castle and a decision about killing the king. Okay, so if we think back to kind of how a character's developing, so Macbeth's developing towards being this evil character, and he's on that trajectory from the start, or how the tension is developing, as we looked at that graph at the beginning of the lesson, it's being ratcheted up all the way through here. So that's what we're moving towards. So we can see that Macbeth's kind of moving through these different stages by the ending of the act, isn't he? He's the hero at the beginning, isn't he? And we're hearing all these wonderful things about how fantastic he's been in battle. He's this heroic figure, but then we have him tempted by the witches, and we see pretty quickly how conflicted he is because of that, and the kind of sort of tension that he's feeling within himself, and he kind of is trying to talk himself into going ahead with the murder, and then he pulls back from it again. And so again, we've got this kind of, in the same as I was saying about the sort of toing and froing between the settings, we've got a same sort of internal toing and froing for Macbeth between his decisions and his own sense of morality. But by the ending of the scene, he has come to some sort of resolution. Okay, so by the end of the scene, he's resolved to do it, and his last words in the act are, false face must hide what false heart doth know, and that's the last thing he says at the end of Act 1, Scene 7, after he's just been discussing the situation again with Lady Macbeth, and it's interesting that he says that, because it sounds like he's made a decision, doesn't he? False face must hide what the false heart doth know, but it's almost like he doesn't kind of trust his own heart here. And obviously he's speaking about his heart, not as in kind of the sense of the seat of love, that sort of image of it. It's like his brain, really, his heart is what's in his heart is what's in his mind. So it's the idea that his heart is false here gives us an early indication that he's going through with something that he doesn't, even though he's said to his wife that he's going to do it and that's it, he doesn't really agree with it. And so he's putting on a false face to the world, but he's being false to himself as well. So in terms of the kind of trajectory of the language, it's quite interesting to think about all of these paradoxes and oppositions that have been going on all the way through the act. Kind of builds into this moment where he says, yes, I'll do it, but he doesn't really want to do it, and he's not just kind of putting on a false face to the world of the castle around him. He's doing it to himself and deceiving himself into going ahead with it. Okay, but that's a really intriguing last line. And of course we know that there'll be more toing and froing in Act 2, where it isn't just as simple as that he's going to do it. It takes a lot more wrestling with his conscience. Okay, so you might want to pause the video there to jot down some ideas that we've just talked through, and then when you're ready, if you press play again, we'll go back to the graph that we started at the beginning of the lesson, and we'll finish off there. Okay, so come back to us when you're ready. Okay, so your last activity is to go back to the tension graph from the beginning of the lesson, where you plotted how an audience would be feeling at your sort of 6 to 10 events that you've picked. And what we're going to do now, just to finish off, is to just look back at those and think about audience reaction in more detail. When you do your piece of writing, obviously the question is, how does he engage the audience? How does he interest the audience? So your discussion of audience reaction is going to get you lots of marks and things to talk about in your essay. So let's look back at where I left my graph. Okay, so at each point of tension, so I've just got 6, what I want you to do is to add a note thinking about what's the audience interested in there and what are they thinking about. So we know that it's all about tension because that's what the point of the graph is, but can you start to give me a little bit more detail? Okay, and if you look back at the final slide on your PowerPoint, I've typed in some examples in a little bit more detail for you, but I just thought I'd try and show you a little bit more here so that just if anyone's stuck it might help you. But my notes aren't as detailed here as I'm hoping that yours might be, but that's just because of space. Okay, so if we go back to that first moment of the play that I was talking about, the first appearance of the witches, that I said the audience would be feeling a moment of high tension. I could develop that a bit further and talk about that it kind of creates feelings of foreboding, this sense of fear and evil. Shakespeare's starting big here. He's going in really dramatically here, and with these sort of really sinister ideas about evil and wickedness, and that creates a real sense of foreboding and a sense that things are going to go badly wrong. Obviously we've turned up to see a tragedy, so we're expecting that anyway, but particularly once Macbeth's name's mentioned, we have these feelings of dread and these feelings of inevitability. It's a tragedy, so what's going to happen has to happen, and we feel that it is Macbeth's doomed from the outset. Okay, the interaction between the captain and Duncan, I said, was quite low tension, so the audience is going to be feeling kind of celebratory for Duncan and his army, and it's a scene of jubilation, isn't it? And we've got this kind of hero worship of Macbeth, so does that, we're kind of engaging in the celebration, but are we thinking, oh no, he is a good character and it's gonna go really badly wrong? Does that kind of heighten the anxiety over the character of Macbeth and his tragic journey? Okay, so the entrance of Macbeth, I was speaking about before, in particular that opening line that he has, so foul and fair a day I have not seen, echoing the words of the witches. We kind of see him as we just heard that he's a hero, but actually I'm starting to feel dread because he's being presented as so heroic, and then here he is echoing the words of the witches, so I might add the word dread to that as well. Okay, the interesting thing to think about Macbeth, we've heard about what he's like in battle, he rarely talks about it himself. You might want to have a little look back and see if you can see that he does say anything about battle and what it was like to be fighting in those battles. We don't really get a sense of it from him. Okay, and then we just straight after that get Macbeth's predictions with the witches. Again, the symbol of evil and wickedness and all of the kind of control that we've just talked about them exercising. So here we can see that Macbeth is tempted, and through the soliloquy we can see how far and how quickly he is tempted, and we're really feeling anxiety and worry for that. But this is a kind of delicious anxiety and worry because this is what makes a good story, isn't it? We want to feel like that. We want to be engaged in that way. Okay, and then we meet Lady Macbeth, and she always elicits quite a complex array of emotions in any audience member. So there's lots of interesting things to think about with her. Oops, Daisy, I didn't mean to do that. So we're intrigued by her because of those things that I was talking about before, that she's quite transgressive. She's doing things that we wouldn't expect a woman to do. She's summoning spirits, so we can see this development of the supernatural. So she's unconventional, she's intriguing, she's unusual. But perhaps, particularly for a Jacobean audience, she's unnatural. Okay, so she's someone who really gets audiences interested. So you might have been interested in Macbeth, but Macbeth's perhaps more your typical hero at this stage, whereas Lady Macbeth, you might sort of stop and think, well, hang on, I've not seen too many characters like this before. And really, in Shakespeare, you don't see too many marriages like this. So that's another interesting thing to think about, how these two work together and how Shakespeare gets us interested in their relationship at this stage. What might attract these two characters to each other? What might have got them together? And into Act Two, what are this couple going to do? So we're all very interested in those things. And last of all, then, we're really worried about Macbeth's conscience, aren't we? By point 6, decision time, by the end of the act, and we've seen him wrestling with the conscience so far already in the act. So what's interesting is that it's quite clear that although this play started with war and conflict in a turbulent time, or a time of hurly-burly as the witches might describe it, the play isn't only just going to be about turbulent acts and about big dramatic moments. We're going to have moments of characters like Macbeth wrestling with their conscience, and it's going to be quite a psychological play. So for some members of the audience, that psychological element is going to be really attractive, particularly a modern audience. We like our psychological thrillers, don't we? So that side of Macbeth's characterisation is really going to appeal to us, isn't it? Okay, I hope I've given you some ideas for you to think about. I just don't want anybody sat at home thinking you haven't got any ideas to write about this week. So please come back to these videos again if they're helpful. And obviously you've had all of the fantastic lessons on Act 1 so far, and the RSC lessons, so you should have loads of things in mind. But if not, come back to the videos again and have another look and see what else you can add to your notes, so that you can all get up and running and have a go at a piece of writing this week, and see how far you've come in your work on Macbeth, because you've all been working really hard. Okay, I think that's it from me. You can email me or any of your English teachers if you've got any more questions. Thank you very much. Bye.